Hello everyone, and welcome to another Design Deconstruct. In this video, I'll take apart the first hour or so of the Messenger and show you what it teaches the player, how it does it, and why I think they've done it the way that they have. So let's get started. Following the intro, this is the first thing we see. Before we take a single step, we've been given some key information. The colour used for the floating platform we're standing on is identical to that of the ground on the right hand side of our starting position. This indicates to the player that anything matching this colour is likely to be the foreground layer and that we can stand on it. Looking at this foreground detail, it's pretty clear that we are going to want to move to the right. This is further reinforced by the movement at the end of the cutscene and the facing directions of the player. From the very first screen, this starts a pattern of encouraging the player to move from left to right. Once this first section is complete, we're gated almost straight away. We won't be able to progress much until we jump. To reinforce this, the same thing is repeated 3 times immediately. After a short delay, there's another set of 3 jumps to remind you. At this early stage, you aren't prevented from backtracking, but obviously you can't really go much further back than the water on the main screen. Next, we're introduced to one of the core mechanics of the game, something that interacts with nearly every other system, so it's vital that the player understands it. It's for this reason that I think it's presented with a more traditional format. A short, unskippable cutscene plays, showing the technique and providing text to explain how it operates. There's also a slight concession to modern video game affordances. Cinema bars coming from the top and bottom of the screen. Most players these days understand that to mean this is a non-interactive cutscene that's playing. Generally, I'm not a fan of enforced cutscenes that provide text explanations of how to do something, but in this case, I'm okay with it because I feel it matches the style of the game it's trying to emulate. Once the short cutscene is complete, we're presented with another hard gate for this ability. There is no way you're progressing further into the game without successfully using this technique. There are 2 things they do to support the understanding of this which I really like. Firstly, the NPC ninjas carry out the move so that you can see what a successful attempt will look like. This is really helpful to explain a new technique to a player, especially if it's one they're unlikely to have seen before. Optionally, you can also talk to the NPC who told you what to do initially and ask for additional information. As getting this extra information is opt-in, it doesn't lead to frustration, so I think this works well. Once we pass this gate, we can be sure that the player knows how to jump and how to attack. They should also be aware that they can combine the 2 for the cloud step. Interestingly, this is immediately followed up with an opportunity to chain 2 cloud steps together, but this is not strictly enforced. You can progress without successfully carrying out the move. This is a pattern that is often repeated in the game. It encourages mastery of the systems, but doesn't make such mastery mandatory to progress. Just one more thing about the cloud step. The text description clearly explains that this will work with any attack, not just attacks on lantern objects like this. However, the gating doesn't require to use anything else, and neither do the next few examples. It's possible that some players may not realise the full power of the technique for quite some time. However, I believe this also may have been somewhat intentional, letting the player make their own discoveries as they play. After you're given a few opportunities to mess around with the cloud step technique, you drop down a wall that prevents you from backtracking any further. This closes down the amount of space the player has to worry about and further reinforces their desire to move to the right. Shortly afterwards, the player will trigger another cutscene and they will discover that once again, they can only move to the right. This triggers yet another cutscene, which presumably shows off late game content. This does 2 things. Provides a dramatic story beat right away and starts the player anticipating how and when they'll encounter those enemies. Also, those paying attention will notice that the player gets their first time shard from an enemy killed by the Western hero, but they won't be told what that even is for a little bit longer. For anyone that spots this, it adds a little bit of mystery to motivate them to continue playing. Now we transition to the next level. Note that this time the player isn't in the centre of the frame, and this placement combined with the facing direction encourages you to move to the right, but by this stage, it's something the player should really be expecting anyway. Something else that wasn't enforced in our initial jump gating tutorial is the fact that if you hold jump, you go higher. While this is a pretty common mechanic in platformers that players usually pick up instinctively, it's gated here for the first time to ensure that everyone understands the difference. Even though we probably don't know what they do yet, the time shards are used effectively to suggest good movement patterns to the player. This will crop up multiple times in the first hour. They highlight good routes for executing cloud steps and will often lead the player along the correct path as well. The shards will also lead them straight into the path of the first enemy. This first enemy is slow moving with no ranged attack. They also start pretty far away from the player. This means there is a very generous amount of time for the player to perceive it as a threat and recall the attack button. Again, we have more time shards as hints. You're encouraged to try and link 2 cloud steps together to kill them both. Notice we're also introduced to spikes for the first time, but they're positioned in such a way that it's unlikely you'll bump into them. We're also introduced to a new enemy type that launches projectiles. We start with just one on its own, so the player has a chance to build a mental model of how this new enemy works. During this level, we are also taught that some blocks can be destroyed. The game does a few things here to make this understanding as smooth as possible. Firstly, the blocks appear directly in front of the player as they move left to right. On the far side of the blocks we can see more lanterns, so the player knows they must be able to get there. Finally, the same foreground colour is used all the way along the platform, indicating that the player should be able to walk there. There's only really two things we can do, jump or attack. And attack's the only one that seems useful here, so when the player strikes the block, it immediately gives strong audio and visual feedback, so they know that it's working. When you die, a demon comes along and takes some of your currency and drops you back at the checkpoint. All of this is only explained to you once you die, potentially before you're even aware that you had currency. Clearly it's a justifiable expectation that you're going to die in this game pretty early on, and I think this meshes neatly with the style of the game. It's expected to be tough, so you're expected to die. Players familiar with the genre may have already figured this out earlier, but progress is gated until the player correctly drops through this thin platform. Once again, the shards are used to lead the player in the right direction. This is later reinforced with another gate. Next we have a textbook example of the Metroidvania unlock loop. You're trapped here until you gain the new ability. The jump you have isn't enough to clear the gap at the top. The shards once again reassure the player that this is the intended path. We also see a bunch of lanterns we can't reach on the other side, giving the player some motivation to return to this area as soon as they can. The only other option is to enter the shop, where the player is presented with the climbing claws. Interestingly, we're told how to use the claws in the shop, rather than contextually as we arrive at the wall. Normally I don't like this, but I think it's forgivable since the first use of the claws is just so close. Teleporting to and from the shop acts as the bounce. When you return to the gate, you're already facing the wall you're able to climb. The notches in the wall will force the player to jump over them. This makes the player aware that they're still able to jump in this state. When the player exits the gate, they're shown some broken edges they can't climb with the claws. This is reinforced several times throughout the game. We're also later forced to swim in order to progress. We can see where we're likely to come out at the other end, so have confidence that that's the intended path. In order to get through this section at the bottom, you need to realise that pressing jump will make you swim up. The game also has separate challenge rooms, which reward you with a special coin. What makes the entrance to these challenge rooms different from the main path? The majority of the detail in the scene will draw the player's eye away from this challenge route. This is in addition to it being placed against the normal flow from left to right. Another nice touch is that the return route is easier than the entrance was. Once the challenge is complete, it shouldn't be a challenge to get back to the critical path. Later on, a combined save point and a shop in an otherwise quiet room sets up a boss fight. I'll be honest, I don't really have much to say about the first boss encounter. As we enter the next level, we'll quickly have a surprise drop into the catacombs below. This is the first time we've entered a new level from below, rather than the right hand side. The shards are once again used to tip off a player that this object here can be attacked like the lantern. Note this is only the second hard gating of the cloud step technique. If you don't use it here, you will die. I feel that's forgivable in this situation because you will barely lose any progress when that happens. Note also that the edges of the catacomb you've fallen in from have the same rough edge to indicate that the player can't climb this, as we've seen before. From this point onwards, the game is confident that you understand the basics and begins ramping up the difficulty. Movable spikes and platforms that can crush you appear. You're given more opportunities to try the cloud step ability, sometimes doing 2 or 3 in a row. New enemy types appear and they're combined much more quickly than in the opening levels. Spikes are added to the swimming section to make it much less tolerant of errors. Areas begin combining jumping, wall claws, water, and crushing platforms. The rate of new stuff increases all the time. You are also introduced to destructible platforms in a safe manner, but these are much more quickly combined with other hazards that demand tight controller input. We also see another challenge room that repeats the pattern of the first. The entrance is not hidden as such, but is unlikely to be encountered in the natural flow through the level. Once a challenge is completed, the room changes to make the return path considerably easier, much like the first example. A significant new enemy type is introduced, as well as foreshadowing what is presumably an upcoming boss battle. The enemy is placed dead in the centre of the screen here, where you're most likely to see it. First, you'll just see one on their own, before increasing the difficulty by having more of them at once. The spikes and moving platforms are eventually combined for this brief chase sequence. Each element has been introduced separately before this point. The game continues to offer chances to chain the cloud step movement without enforcing it. At the same time, more enemies are placed into small spaces, mixing projectile and movement types. This requires the player to become better at crowd control, as well as many chances to use the cloud step. And that's about as far as I got in an hour. As usual, I was focusing so much on the details, I was often killed by stuff I wasn't really looking at. Oops. This game takes an interesting strategy in its first hour. Rather than enforcing some of the more complicated moves to ensure players understand them, it just ensures the basics are covered and then gently nudges the player to attempt more complex moves. Like I said at the start, the game encourages mastery, but it does not require it to make progress. This is extended to the small unlock tree as well. Experienced players can purchase offensive abilities before buying more health because they don't need it. The encouragement to master a technique and a clear understanding of risk reward is best demonstrated by this cloud step mechanic. The more you attack, the more you put yourself at risk, the more mobile you become. With that in mind, I think they've done a great job of building an introduction to a game that mirrors those values. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next Design Deconstruct.